The horse found her before any man did. It was a cold March morning in 1829 when a tenant farmer working a low-lying field near the Delaware and Maryland border watched his plow horse stumble and sink to its chest in soft earth. When he dug down to free the animal, he found wood. A chest deliberately constructed, fitted together with the care of someone who had done this kind of work before and intended it to last. Inside the chest were bones. Human bones, the skull caved in on one side with the particular geometry of a hammer blow, the kind of damage that leaves no ambiguity about what happened and no comfort about how quickly. It was just the beginning. By the time authorities finished working that property and the surrounding land, they had uncovered the remains of at least 7 people, including 3 children. The earth had been keeping secrets for nearly 2 decades. It had simply run out of room. The woman responsible had a name that was already spoken quietly along the Delmarva Peninsula, in the way people speak about something they fear but cannot prove: Martha Cannon. Patty, to those who knew her, though knowing her was not something anyone survived without cost. For nearly 20 years, she had operated what historians would later call the reverse Underground Railroad, a network designed not to carry people to freedom, but to drag free people back into bondage and sell them south into the cotton fields of Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia. She had also killed, methodically and without apparent conscience, anyone who threatened to expose what she had built. Rival traders, witnesses, children. The number of people indicted for was 4. The number she admitted to, near the end, was closer to 24. The number no one will ever know is larger than either. The geography had chosen her as much as she had chosen it. The area that locals called Johnson's Crossroads sat at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions: Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. A pocket of land where state lines ran through the middle of buildings and lawmen stopped at invisible boundaries while criminals simply stepped across them. Dense pine forests stretched for miles in every direction. The Nanticoke River wound through the wetlands like a dark vein, deep enough to move cargo by flat-bottomed boat under cover of night, without anyone in any town being the wiser. Roads were little more than mud tracks that became impassable in rain. The nearest substantial settlement was a day's hard ride away. It was, in every meaningful sense, a place that had been designed by accident for concealment. Cannon had arrived sometime around 1790, married a local farmer named Jesse, and settled into the kind of unremarkable rural life that draws no attention and asks no questions. Jesse died around 1826 under circumstances that were never examined closely enough to satisfy anyone who thought about them for long. Some said she had poisoned him. No one looked hard enough to confirm it. What mattered to Cannon was that his death left her with full control of the property, the income, and the decisions, and she had been making the decisions in practice for years before the paperwork caught up. The economics of her enterprise were born from a specific historical wound. When Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the price of an enslaved person in the domestic market more than tripled overnight. A man who had cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South, where cotton was expanding across the Gulf Coast states and planters were desperate for labor they could no longer import legally. The Delmarva Peninsula was full of free black people, men and women and children, who had been emancipated after the Revolutionary War by owners with sudden consciences or changing fortunes. They were legally free. They were also, in practice, almost completely unprotected. They could not vote. They could not testify in court against white defendants. They were required to carry papers proving their freedom at all times, papers that could be destroyed in seconds by someone with the right motivation. Their disappearances generated almost no official response from a legal system that did not fully accept their humanity. Cannon understood this with the cold precision of a predator who has studied her terrain. Her daughter's first husband, a blacksmith named Henry Brereton, had already been working the same territory when Cannon was refining her methods. His trade gave him legitimate reasons to travel widely, to visit farms and settlements and chat with families about their children and their situations and their plans. He was arrested for kidnapping in 1811, escaped from jail that same year, and was eventually hanged in 1813 after participating in the murder of a slave trader at Cannon's Tavern. His execution taught Cannon one lesson and one lesson only, that the men she worked with needed to be more careful, and that she herself needed to be further removed from anything that could be directly witnessed. Her second son-in-law, Joseph Johnson, understood logistics the way Brereton had never bothered to. He brought to the partnership a tavern positioned so precisely on the state line that different rooms existed in different legal jurisdictions. Delaware warrants could not touch a man standing on the Maryland side of the building. Maryland warrants expired at the doorframe. The tavern functioned simultaneously as a legitimate business, a holding facility with specially constructed underground cells, and a meeting ground for the network of men who worked for Cannon across multiple states. Beneath the common room, accessible through concealed entrances, iron rings had been set into stone walls. The ventilation was calculated to keep people alive without allowing sound to escape. The conditions were not designed for comfort. They were designed for storage. The gang itself was assembled with a cynical practicality. It included white criminals, mixed-race men who could move between communities without immediately raising suspicion, and even enslaved people forced to help capture others. A man named John Purnell, described in court records as a man of mixed heritage, was particularly valuable. He could present himself differently depending on which community he was working, approaching free black families as a peer, presenting himself to white merchants as a legitimate businessman. He maintained multiple identities and moved between them without visible effort. He was the face that families saw before they disappeared. The methods for acquiring victims ranged from crude to sophisticated, depending on the target. Some were simply seized on isolated roads, overpowered by multiple men, and transported under cover of darkness to the holding facilities beneath Johnson's Tavern. Others were approached with offers of employment in distant locations, work in Georgia or Mississippi with transportation provided and wages guaranteed. Parents struggling to find opportunities for their children sometimes allowed them to travel with these supposed employers. They never received word from their children again. The children were stripped of their papers, given false names and false histories, and sold into lifelong bondage before their families had finished waiting for the first letter home. Lydia Smith was 25 years old when she was taken in 1825, seized while walking alone on a road near Philadelphia, and transported by wagon over several days, blindfolded and chained, to the Delaware border. In the underground cells, she found she was not alone. Men, women, and children were held in separate areas, all chained, all fed minimally, all kept in near total darkness except when guards arrived with candles. Their papers had been destroyed. Their names were being replaced. Their lives as free people were being systematically dismantled around them while they sat in the dark and listened to each other breathe. Smith was held for 5 months before Mayor Joseph Watson's network located her and arranged her rescue. Most of the people who passed through those cells were never found. Watson, a Quaker and the mayor of Philadelphia, had been tracking disappearances from his city and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula for years. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings connected to the Cannon network. He offered $500 in rewards for information, a sum that represented months of wages for most people in the region, and he coordinated with governors across multiple states to build a picture of the full operation. The picture was enormous and deeply organized. This was not opportunistic crime. This was an industry. It was the white victims who had first attracted serious law enforcement attention, and that fact alone tells the story of what American justice looked like in 1829, when a slave trader from Georgia named Bell or Miller disappeared around 1820 while carrying an estimated $35,000 intended for purchasing enslaved people. His business partners demanded investigations. His horse later turned up in Cannon's possession. She offered an explanation that no one believed, and that no one at the time had the authority to disprove. The pattern of murdering rival traders who passed through the territory with large amounts of cash had become a second revenue stream for the gang, one that carried higher risk precisely because these victims had people who cared about their whereabouts. The most crucial witness against Cannon was a boy she had purchased when he was 7 years old and raised in her household to serve the operation. His name was Cyrus James. By the time he was old enough to understand what he was being forced to participate in, he had already helped identify victims, acted as a decoy to lure free black people into the gang's range, and witnessed things that most adults never see and never recover from. Cannon controlled him through a combination of dependency and terror, alternating between treating him as part of the household and reminding him with careful precision what happened to people who disappointed her or who talked to the wrong person. He was property. He was also, she understood, a potential catastrophe if he ever decided the risk of speaking was smaller than the cost of continuing silence. James later testified to what he had witnessed Cannon do to children who became sick or difficult, or who she had decided were more trouble than they were worth. He described seeing her carry a wounded child out of the house in her apron. The child never came back. He had helped dispose of bodies in wooden chests in soft ground because she had told him to, and because he was 7, and then 8, and then 12, and the choices available to a child who is owned by someone are not the choices available to anyone else. When authorities finally moved on the property in early 1829, following the tenant farmer's discovery, they dug systematically across the grounds. In the garden, they found the body of a young mixed-race child. In a separate area, they found 2 more wooden chests, each containing human bones. One set belonged to a child James had watched Cannon beat to death with a piece of wood. The other belonged to an adult the gang had believed held property and might be worth robbing directly rather than selling. The cut marks on some of the bones were consistent with disposal rather than any concern for ceremony. These had been problems that needed solving. Cannon had solved them. James was captured on April 3, 1829, attempting to leave the region. Facing execution for the crimes he had been forced to commit, he made the only calculation available to him and offered everything he knew to the authorities. His testimony was exact and detailed and navigated investigators directly to evidence that could not be explained away. The prosecution case was built. The trial was scheduled. Delaware legal history was about to be made. Patty Cannon was found dead in her cell on May 11, 1829, 3 weeks before her scheduled execution. The official cause was poison, arsenic most likely, obtained through means that were never definitively established. Her cell was locked from the outside. A small vial was found hidden in her clothing. She had lived for 70 years by maintaining absolute control over every situation she entered, and she died the same way, on her own schedule, denying the court and the families of her victims the conclusion they had waited decades for. During her weeks of imprisonment, she had spoken with the flat candor of someone who genuinely did not understand why she was being prosecuted. She described her crimes as business: the killing of children, the destruction of families, the sale of hundreds of human beings into lifelong bondage. She discussed all of it with the same casual indifference she might have used to describe any other form of livestock management. The absence of remorse was total, not suppressed, not hidden behind legal strategy, simply absent, the way a capacity that was never developed cannot be found when you go looking for it. Her body was buried without ceremony in the jail graveyard. When that land was later converted to a parking lot, her remains were moved to a potter's field. Her skull was separated from the rest of her remains at some point during this process and was placed on display in various venues over the years. As recently as 1961, it sat on loan at the Dover Public Library, resting in a hatbox, a small and unremarkable container for everything that had been wrong about her. Joseph Johnson and his brother Ebenezer fled south before the investigation reached them and were never successfully prosecuted. The network they had built continued operating in some diminished form beyond the reach of Delaware courts. Only Cyrus James, the child who had been purchased and used and finally broken enough to choose truth over survival, received something approaching justice. The Delaware courts recognized the coercion under which he had acted and granted him his freedom. He was relocated to Pennsylvania. Some accounts suggest he later worked with the actual Underground Railroad, using his intimate knowledge of how criminal trafficking networks operated to help people move in the opposite direction. The conservative estimate is that the Cannon Gang trafficked between 500 and 1,000 people into slavery over the course of their operations. The real number is higher. Most of the victims were never found, never recovered, and lived out the remainder of their lives in bondage hundreds of miles from their homes, their names dissolved. Their histories were replaced. The children they had or might have had were born into the system that had consumed them. The mathematics of it compound across generations in ways that resist any simple accounting. The area around Johnson's Crossroads eventually changed its name to Reliance, which is the kind of thing communities do when they want to suggest they have moved on from something they have not moved on from. The original house was torn down in 1948. The soft ground continued for years afterward to give back what had been put into it. Floods surfaced bones. Rain worked fragments upward through the soil. The earth, patient and indifferent, returned what it had been asked to hold, leaving it on the surface in the pale morning light for anyone who happened to be walking past to see. Almost no one was walking past. The silence of those roads, the willingness of an entire community to organize its vision around not seeing what was directly in front of it, is not a historical curiosity. It is the actual mechanism by which Cannon operated for 2 decades without serious interference. She did not succeed despite her community. She succeeded because of it, because the people who knew, or suspected, or looked away, had made the same calculation she was counting on them to make, that the cost of knowing was higher than the comfort of not knowing, and that the people disappearing were not people whose disappearance required them to do anything at all. That calculation is the thing that outlasted her. It is the thing that always does.